Over the past decade, Australia and China have developed a close and complex economic relationship. China emerged as Australia's largest trading partner in goods and services, representing roughly one-third of Australia's total trade by the late 2010s. Iron ore, coal, liquefied natural gas, and agricultural products have all been significant exports from Australia to China, fueling growth in both nations. But despite the obvious mutual benefits that come from strong economic ties, the bilateral relationship has been strained in recent years, leading to tariffs, trade restrictions, and other measures that limited economic exchange between the two economies. But before we talk about the issues that came out as of late, let's first talk about the economic relationship that has emerged between the two. The China-Australia diplomatic relationship was established back in 1972. But what led the economic relationship to blossom was China's economic rise and Australia's resource exports. Australia is home to vast reserves of natural resources, including iron ore, coal, and natural gas, all of which are needed to fuel China's manufacturing industry. Companies like Rio Tinto, BHP, and Fortescue Metals found in China a massive and insatiable buyer. Hence, bilateral trade between Australia soared. Here's a graph on the exports of Australia to China. Here, you can see just how much exports rose. Back in 2000, Australia exported only $3.47 billion. But by 2023, it rose to a massive $120 billion. Many see that these exports were amongst the reasons for Australia's extraordinary economic growth. How is that so? Well, you can see it if we take a look at the overall exports of Australia. Here's an updated graph on that matter. Here, you can see that Australia's exports are big, and in 2023, it's over $460 billion. This export, however, is spread across the entire world, whether that be the United States, European countries, African countries, and China. But as you saw earlier, for the very same year, Australia exported over $120 billion to China alone. That means over 1/4 of Australia's total exports were destined for China. That just shows how important China has been for Australia. Another key defining moment that occurred between China and Australia was in 2015. Back then, a key agreement was signed called China-Australia Free Trade Agreement in December 2015. The agreement eliminated or reduced tariffs on many Australian exports to China, including dairy, beef, and wine. What that basically meant was that Australian exporters could sell their goods to China at lower prices, making their products more competitive in the Chinese market. Eliminating or reducing tariffs meant fewer trade barriers, allowing Australian goods like dairy, beef, and wine to enter China more easily and at a lower cost to Chinese buyers. This boosted demand for Australian products, significantly benefiting Australian farmers, winemakers, and exporters by increasing their market share in China. Here's a graph on Australia's export selected category to China in 2014. Here, you can see that in that year, prior to the agreement being signed, exports of meat and edible offal amounted to only $1.01 billion. Wine exports, on the other hand, was only $183 million. By 2019, just 5 years later, the exports of meat and edible offal rose to over $2.74 billion, while wine exports rose dramatically to over $1.1 billion. But of course, these aren't really big exports. The total exports of Australia to China for that year of 2019 was $88 billion, and these are just small in comparison. So, why bother with these small categories? Well, that's because they would see a huge shift in just 1 year. In 2020, as the world saw the COVID-19 pandemic unfold, Australia, alongside other nations, called for an independent investigation into the origins of the virus. What this basically meant was that Australia sought transparency and accountability regarding how the pandemic began, with the aim of preventing future global health crises. However, this move was met with strong resistance from China, which perceived it as a direct challenge to its sovereignty and an attempt to politicize the pandemic. Hence, bilateral relations deteriorated rapidly, and in May 2020, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce imposed anti-dumping and anti-subsidy duties on Australian barley totaling 80.5%. Australia's barley exports to China dropped massively. Here's a graph on the share of Australian barley exports by destination from 2017 to 2020. Here you can see that China has been the biggest destination for barley, but as the duties increased, changes occurred. Here's the updated graph on the exports by destination from 2020 to 2021. Here you can see in just 1 year, the biggest export destination is no longer China. Neither is it even in the list anymore. This just shows how China could effectively eradicate millions of dollars, or even possibly billions, in just a short amount of time. But the problem with these barley tariffs is that there were more. From June to July 2020, we saw a number of warnings coming from China, telling their citizens about travelling to Australia, claiming incidents of racial discrimination against Asians. Soon after, reports emerged of Chinese state-owned utilities receiving instructions to halt purchases of Australian coal. Concurrently, China began halting imports from select Australian beef processors, citing technical non-compliance issues. By November of 2020, Chinese authorities effectively imposed extra tariffs on Australian wine, with duties reaching as high as 212%. Wine has been one of Australia's success stories in China. From about 212 million Australian dollars in 2014 to around 1.1 billion Australian dollars in 2020. The wine sector became the highest profile casualty of the diplomatic rift, impacting major wine-growing regions such as South Australia's Barossa Valley and Western Australia's Margaret River. Hence, as you can see in the graph right here, if we update it stretching to the latest data available, we get to see a big drop in exports. In 2022, Australian wine exports amounted to only $20.9 million. That is nothing when we compare it to the $1.1 billion exports seen just a couple of years ago, although as you can see in 2024, exports have gone back up again. But that's only because China has eased some of its trade restrictions as diplomatic relations began to thaw. But we'll talk more about that later. By late 2020 to early 2021, diplomatic ties further soured. Australia then found itself on the receiving end of a slew of informal restrictions on other products, including lobster, timber, cotton, sugar, and copper concentrates. In certain cases, cargoes bound for Chinese ports faced extensive customs delays. Australian coal shipments were stranded off the Chinese coast for months, leading to significant financial losses for both miners and shipping companies. Here's a graph to show you the overall impact of these restrictions. The graph that you see here is the total import of China from various countries in 2019. As you can see, Australia accounted for 6.48% of China's total imports. That made their share higher than the United States, Germany, and a long list of other nations. But as we update the graph and see what it looks like in 2022, we get to see that Australia's share of China's imports decrease, although not drastically, but the United States surpassed Australia, and there were nations that increased rapidly as Australia saw a slight decrease. Now, of course, Australia didn't like this. Hence, they escalated the dispute to the WTO, filing formal complaints against China's barley and wine tariffs. While the dispute settlement process is often lengthy, involving panel rulings and potential appeals, the move signalled Canberra's resolve to challenge what it deemed unjustified trade barriers. In Canberra, the Morrison government emphasised the importance of standing up for Australian values and the rules-based international order. The United States, the European Union, and other allies quietly expressed support for Australia, recognising that similar coercive tactics might be used against them if the Chinese approach proved successful. Meanwhile, Australian officials explored ways to diversify export markets, from Southeast Asia to the Middle East, to mitigate the fallout from the Chinese restrictions. By 2022 to 2023, however, there were glimpses of diplomatic thaw occasionally appearing. By 2023, newly elected governments in both Australia, the Albanese government from mid-2022, and changes in policy tones from Beijing opened small windows for dialogue. Still, the legacy of the trade dispute remained, with most tariffs and restrictions on wine and barley still in place at the start of 2023. Australia continued its WTO cases and increased negotiations with other countries for trade deals to reduce reliance on any single market. Finally, by the mid to end of 2023, China has started to ease their tariffs. For instance, in August of 2023, they removed the tariffs, which consisted of a 73.6% anti-dumping tariff and a 6.9% anti-subsidy tariff on barley. This then saw an increase of barley imports again. Likewise, by early 2024, they abolished the heavy tariffs on wine. That is why, as we saw in the earlier graph, Australian exports of wine to China rose in that year, since China had removed the tariffs. By the end of 2024, they dropped the tariffs on beef. Indeed, the relations have thawed and everything is looking good now. But of course, it is true that even though China has imposed tariffs on some industries, they weren't very big industries. They could have, for instance, taken a tougher stance on iron ore, which is amongst the largest imports made in Australia from China. But the reason they did not impose tariffs on larger goods is because China needs them. Just like how Australia is reliant on China for exports, China is also reliant on Australia for imports. Here's a graph on the Australian exports to China by category. As you can see, iron ore is massive, and they can't just place tariffs on these. If they did, they would face a lot of problems in their own domestic economy. Nevertheless, this still shows a lesson for many nations. Once praised as a model for how a smaller state can benefit from China's rise, Australia found itself on the receiving end of a series of punitive trade measures that tested its resolve, economic resilience, and foreign policy principles. But anyway, do let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.